Vex, I have to say, it is entertaining watching an AMD fanboy have a little crisis because AMD are being scummy. I have said before, Nvidia and AMD are just the same. It's all about the money. It's just, Nvidia are better at it. Crazy how differently you approach the two companies doing the same scummy stuff. But don't worry, I come here knowing I'm getting a Team Red angle.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint this guy in the comments, but this is not going to be a very positive Team Red video, but hopefully it will be a learning opportunity for them. I think it's important to note how many things that I criticize, or really anybody criticizes Nvidia for lately. They're doing a ton of scummy stuff that we'll definitely go over in this video, but Nvidia is able to get away with these things because there isn't a company that's putting up enough competition to scare them into doing anything better for the consumers. AMD also has some major problems. So much so that I went through my entire game library just to try out AMD graphics cards in these games to see why is it an issue. And this leads to the entire industry stagnating. It's very important to make innovation through competition. But I think it's important to know with AMD that they're not like a completely incompetent company or anything like that, because they have a huge CPU market. Their Ryzen CPUs do extremely well. In fact, they're beating out Intel right now, their biggest competitor there. AMD is doing great on like the Windows or even Steam Deck side of things with mobile computing. AMD processors are great. They also have a huge presence in the console market, which might be one of the reasons why the GPU market struggles so much on PC, but we'll dig into that a little bit later as well. It's just when it comes to graphics cards, and I think we need to start from more of a beginning type of point. So I'm gonna go back as far as I can remember, all right? So I'm 23 years old. So if you have anything else to add about AMD ups or anything like that, leave them in the comments below because I'm interested to read them all. AMD can make really good value graphics cards like the RX 580. Now this card came out back in, when was this? 2017, so pretty old now. And back then, just to put into perspective, this RX 580 was $230 and it had 8 gigabytes of VRAM. That's still the same setup that we're getting today in 2025. That's pretty bad look. And you can see how popular it's been. If you scroll down the Steam hardware survey, one of the most popular graphics cards in the world from AMD, there's a RX 580. It's their second most popular graphics card, despite it being so old right now. You can see that it's still at like 0.75% of people have this graphics card. So this is pretty successful. So when AMD nails it, they can freaking nail it. Back in 2017, they also announced this funny little thing called Vega. This was an interesting move by AMD, and here's unhinged Linus here because this is like this is getting kind of old now. This is 2017. It's interesting because at the time, Nvidia was introducing their GTX 1080, 1080 Ti, 1070, 1060, really good competitive graphics cards. Those were back in like 2016 when those Nvidia cards were coming out, but AMD wasn't able to get Vega out until 2017. Interesting, I guess, because this card was an interesting graphics card. There's two versions of it, the Vega 64 and the Vega 56. As you see, this card is a little unconventional because it has HBM2 memory. I know it's nerd shit, but basically that's not a common type of memory on GPUs, and it makes it very fast. And they're able to bring this like workstation type of graphics card architecture down to like a consumer level, which is the first time it has ever really been done. But this card was $500. The problem with it though is that the 1080 also existed. Yes, it was $100 more, but it came out a year prior. And after waiting an entire year for Vega to come out from AMD, and this is confusing to look at this chart, I'm gonna gotta hide my camera. Vega 64 down here and Vega 56 really were just neck and neck with a 1080 at the time. And if we scroll to some other games, we see that the Vega 64 at 122 FPS versus 146 on the 1080. They're pretty much slower than the 1080 most of the time while waiting a year for it. And the real kicker, honestly, is when it came to the power consumption. Here's Vega 64. That was performing worse than a 1080 most of the time. It was drawing 310 watts, and then a 1080 was drawing 227. So like 80 watts less on the 1080. This wasn't that long before Nvidia ended up releasing the 1080 Ti, which just pretty much smoked all these cards. Most people would just go for the 1080 Ti. That thing was a beast. What's weird, I think, is before the next generation of graphics cards, AMD actually introduced another one of these Vega graphics cards, the Radeon 7. To be honest, like, to me, I barely even knew this graphics card existed. I ain't gonna lie, because the Radeon 7 came out in 2019 and it was $700. But its memory bandwidth was over a terabyte per second, which is insane. And I don't think this graphics card did all that well. It was really just like a 1080 Ti while coming out 2 years later than the 1080 Ti did. Interesting concept, but they honestly didn't get it out fast enough. But then just a few months later, after the Radeon 7, AMD introduced the 5700 XT based on their Navi 10 processor. This is RDNA 1, the architecture kind of that we're still on today, and it was for $400, which looked like a pretty decent graphics card. The problem with it though, a year prior, literally a year before this, pretty much 11 months or whatever, if you want to get technical on me, but August 2018, NVIDIA introduced RTX 20 series. And yes, AMD's competition honestly did quite well. If you look at this older hardware unbox video, this 5700 XT competed pretty closely to the 2070, which was a $500 graphics card. Yeah, it was like $100 less, had the same amount of VRAM, was getting similar performance. So honestly, a pretty good deal. It actually made it so that NVIDIA got scared and they had to release a super series for the 20 series GPUs because they had to make them more competitive. So they made like a 2070 Super, they had to make a 2060 Super and all that kind of stuff to compete with AMD's competition. And honestly, the Super series from NVIDIA was pretty damn good. But that's one of the problems with AMD releasing a graphics card so late. It was like a year after NVIDIA did that. But it also was lacking some major technologies that come into play very, very important into the future that AMD was super late on. Again, the innovation is falling behind NVIDIA. NVIDIA introduced DLSS upscaling technology at RTX, and NVIDIA also introduced real-time ray tracing on their GPUs. Now these technologies, especially at launch, were basically just in beta. You couldn't really use them at all. If we check out DLSS 1.0, I got to use this in Monster Hunter World. I went back to that game and just checked it out, and damn, that is not a very great technology from NVIDIA here. DLSS 1.0 really sucked. It didn't get better until later. And also ray tracing was, one, super demanding, and these first generation ray tracing cards could barely handle it, to be honest, but also is barely available in any games whatsoever. Only today is it really starting to get available in a decent few games, and it's still pretty sparse. So yeah, NVIDIA's technologies weren't amazing yet, but they're setting the groundwork for what's going to come in the future. And AMD, at least on the upscaling front, didn't have any competition to NVIDIA until literally 2021. 3 years later, after NVIDIA introduced their cards, AMD released FSR 1.0, which, to be honest, was pretty freaking rough. And by the time they even introduced FSR 1.0, DLSS 2 had already come out. We gotta check out 2020, the year of crypto mining and GPU shortages, bringing back nightmares again for you guys. But what was AMD doing in all this time when NVIDIA was capitalizing on the gaming market by, making these graphics cards and just selling them to miners anyways, and basically scalping gamers that just want a graphics card to game on? So what was AMD doing? We need to take a guess. AMD was doing the exact same shit. Yeah, that was pretty cool. If we zoom in here, this was a chart of AMD GPUs and NVIDIA GPUs during this time period and tracking their price over time. And AMD cards were going for not as high of prices, but really just a little bit cheaper than what NVIDIA's were going for at the same time. Now, can you really avoid this? No, it's like a GPU shortage and stuff, but yeah, the AMD cards, it's not like they were awesome. RDNA 2, the 6000 series, when this was introduced, those were pretty damn good graphics cards at the time. They competed really well against NVIDIA. They even introduced real-time ray tracing on the cards, even though it was pretty damn bad. You'd really never use it. But these cards were competitive, and they were a little bit cheaper than NVIDIA's even during this whole shortage. But then also with RTX 30 series, NVIDIA introduced DLSS 2. And this is where things got really rough for AMD. DLSS 2 came out in 2020. FSR 1 still didn't come out until mid-2021. FSR 1, as you can see, does not look nearly as good here in these games because FSR 1 doesn't take into account any temporal data, it just is a spatial upscaler. Now FSR 2 didn't come out until, I'm pretty sure, 2022, so that was a little bit further away from this. We know to this day that FSR 2 didn't hold up that well against DLSS a lot of the time. And this has harmed FSR to this day because some games choose to not even include it because the devs can make a better temporal upscaler themselves. Like for example, in like Clair Obscure Expedition 33, they just use the TSR upscaler in UE5. In Fortnite, they also do the same thing. And Plague Tale Requiem doesn't bother either. Now, one benefit that AMD does make with their upscalers is that all these technologies are pretty much open source, or the source code is available. I'm not exactly sure how it works. And that's on this website called GPU Open. So you can just kind of check out the stuff. It's available for you. You can integrate it into your games. But at the same time, making something open source or available to you doesn't make the technology better. So good on them for one part, but then bad on them for not making a very good technology and being pretty damn late to it. And that brings us into the next generation of graphics cards. NVIDIA introduced their RTX 40 series cards in 2022 with their own amount of controversy because this was just coming off of the whole mining stuff, so these cards were very expensive at the time. They weren't really that well received either, to be honest. And people saw things like the RTX 4080. And like, hey, the 4080 is pretty rough. NVIDIA unlaunched the RTX 4080 12GB. So people are like, oh, AMD has a good opportunity here to kind of strike back. And at this event, they announced the 7900 XTX for $1,000 and the 7900 XT for $900, just $100 less. Now the XTX was touting performance that was like almost 50% faster than the 6950 XT, which was AMD's last generation top tier graphics card. And for the same price on this new card seemed like a pretty damn good deal, which might confuse you of why these cards were pretty much lukewarm at best when they were first received. They really were not that great. Hardware Unboxed, for example, just look at their thumbnail. They're saying overhyped and underdelivered because AMD was saying the performance was really good. But when you actually look at the data for these cards, then you see the 7900 XTX versus the 6950 XT down here. That is not 50% faster. That is not even 40% faster, which isn't terrible or anything. It's a decent generational improvement, especially nowadays when we see this kind of stuff. But the XTX wasn't like amazing. And also at the time, the RTX 4080 was embarrassing. And the XTX was just $200 less than it while being worse at ray tracing and getting about the same rasterized performance. So these cards weren't really that enticing. I mean, the XTX sold pretty well, but when you consider the XT, this card was only $100 less. Like honestly, at the time, the 6950 XT was going for much less than these cards. You might as well have just bought that one because it's not that far off. And the real problem with that card is that it was $900. It was like, you're just gonna get the XTX every time. They're priced way too close to each other. It just seems like complete incompetence from AMD. How did you not know that these two cards were going to be competing so closely with each other? You're competing against yourself. Like, you have all the control here, yet you're running into this problem. It just seems incompetent and stupid. And then this led to a classic AMD situation where they launch a product in a bad position, and then over time they actually reduce the price. And that meant that much later on down the line, the 7900 XT actually ended up becoming a very good graphics card. SIG Hardware Unboxed and Gamers Nexus re-reviewed it after the price dropped from $900 down to $750. I actually bought a 7900 XT for only $700. And at that price point, it was a pretty damn good deal. Honestly, one of the best deals of all graphics cards, especially at the time. But that didn't matter because at the launch of the graphics card, they completely messed up everything and just messed up everybody's impression of that card. And AMD, you'd think they made that mistake with the 7900 XT. They wouldn't be so incompetent to do that again. Well, bad news, about 10 months later, they introduced the 7800 XT and the 7700 XT. The 7800 XT was a pretty damn good graphics card, but the 7700 XT had less VRAM than the higher tier counterpart, and it was quite a bit slower for the price. It was decent against Nvidia's competition at that price point, but the 7700 XT made no sense in relation to the 7800 XT. You would always pay $50 more to get the better card. And this ended up leading down the line where the 7800 XT maintained $500, but then the 7700 XT ended up dropping down to like $400, maybe $380 for a lot of its lifespan. And at that price point, it was pretty good. I ended up buying one later, and I was pretty impressed with the performance for that price point. Even today, it holds up against some of the newer graphics cards. But why does AMD mess up the launch of their cards? How do they not know how to price it? It's crazy. To me, that screams absolute incompetence. but maybe not as incompetent as this move. During the RTX 40 series graphics card launch, NVIDIA also introduced frame generation with DLSS 3. And yeah, frame generation has its perks, has its negatives. NVIDIA has all kinds of problems with marketing this technology, but AMD at that time, when NVIDIA announced that technology, they said, oh, we should have a competitor to that. So the first thing that they did during their announcement, Fidelity FX Super Resolution 3. And in this technology, they were bringing in frame generation, which had a cool perk of being available on all graphics cards, whereas NVIDIA's technology is only going to be available on their 40 series graphics cards, so they're artificially limiting everybody. The problem is, AMD is the one doing it. And it took them way too long to get this technology out. Maybe they underestimated how complicated it actually was. Maybe they just thought, oh, it's duplicating frames, and we're just interpolating with them, so it can't be that hard to integrate. Well, AMD took till 9/29/2023. This was almost 11 months after the announcement of the technology that it was honestly available in some games. And guess what games they introduced the technology in? Probably your favorite games. I mean, like, everybody loves these games. Forspoken?
I just move shit with my freaking mind!
And Immortals of Avium. I know, amazing games. AMD definitely wanted to put it in the most popular ones because they wanted to show it off to everybody. No, AMD introduced their frame generation technology because they're so confident in it in some really shitty games so that mainstream people wouldn't regularly try the technology, but they could get out there that they introduced it and released the FSR3 frame generation to the public, even though it really wasn't available in any games. And in those two games, when it did come out, honestly, the technology was a freaking mess.
Not only do you now need to worry about base frame rates, but you'll also have to ensure you've set up VSync correctly and are pumping out enough frames to avoid judder. You'll have to be satisfied with sacrificing proper variable refresh rate functionality to access frame generation. But some of these problems really should have been resolved before launch, so that when the tech debuts, it launches with a bang and everyone that turns it on is treated to a great experience. Instead, it seems to me that AMD rushed the feature out the door to make a September launch deadline.
It's gotten so much better nowadays, but man, it took a long time to get there. So this is another case of AMD not being an innovator, but being a follower. It happened with FSR in general, it happened with ray tracing. AMD is not really introducing these new technologies or pushing the industry forward in this field. It's NVIDIA doing that, and then it's AMD playing catch up, which is majorly disappointing. And whenever I say that or anybody says that, a lot of people are gonna get upset because like AMD innovates so much, but I don't see it, man. I just don't see it. I don't see what they do. They innovate in things like on CPU side, but on GPUs, everything that they've tended to do hasn't done that well. Which brings us to the current generation of graphics cards.
Look at this, it's got two fans. This whole graphics card is just one giant fan.
NVIDIA introduced their 50 series cards. 57 equals 4090 performance because they're using frame generation to do that. Crazy shit. Everybody could see through this right away, or I hope that you could see through this right away. And honestly, across the board, a lot of these graphics cards aren't that much better than their last generation counterparts. So it led to a situation where their value wasn't that good. Plus, they had a supply shortage, and the MSRP for these graphics cards didn't seem to exist correctly at all. There's so many people that made videos like RTX 50 disaster. Fake frames, fake prices, price, out of stock, scalping, melting. In only 2 weeks, here's the ugly truth about 50 series so far. RTX 5070 Ti, 750? Nah, it's going over $900. RTX 5070 Ti, I don't trust what I'm being told one bit. 5070 Ti, MSRP is bullshit. GeForce 5070 Ti review, if only it was really $750. 5080, $1,000 for barely any more performance on top of an RTX 4080. I mean, these cards were pretty shit. So this is like the easiest layup of AMD's life, at least you could think. It's like, this is their time to introduce a graphics card generation that's competitive, that's relatively affordable, and maybe they can catch up on some of the technologies that were coming. There's already rumors that AMD was working on technologies like improved upscaling because they work with Sony. So Sony introduced Pisser, their upscaler, their AI upscaler. So AMD was probably going to introduce their AI upscaler as well. And ray tracing was supposed to be greatly improved on these RDNA 4 graphics cards. Everything was lining up for AMD to have a slam dunk. And honestly, they delivered. They announced the 9070 XT and the 9070 for $600 and $550, which meant they were honestly more competing with NVIDIA's 5070. And at that same kind of price point, I'd be picking the AMD cards every time, especially with NVIDIA's fake MSRPs and everything that's going on. And honestly, the 9070 XT is competing very closely with NVIDIA's 5070 Ti, and that card is $750 MSRP, and AMD's card is $150 less at $600. So honestly, really good deal. So all AMD needed to do at this point was to maintain that price point and have these cards in stock for people to buy so they can get these into as many people's hands as possible. And AMD seemed to have been doing that because they were already stocking these in stores 3 or 4 weeks before the real release day. But what ended up happening is crazy. For me, I got a MSRP $600 9070 XT on release day because I went to Micro Center and everything was pretty good. Like, we had a good, enjoyable day, but I saw some rumors going around, and honestly on the same day, that most people couldn't buy these cards, that they were unavailable really. And that meant that the price starting to have some issues on PC Part Picker to this day. So this is almost 4 months after the launch of these cards. The 9070, for example, is still $600. It's supposed to be $550. The 9070 XT is out of stock at $612, which isn't even the MSRP. It's supposed to be $600. The cheapest 9070 XT that is available is $713. I don't even know if this is actually in stock. It's just what PC Part Picker is saying. But that's over $100 on MSRP. So MSRP, not really a thing with AMD's graphics cards either. And the same thing now, I mean, I bought mine at Micro Center. If you go to Micro Center now, the 9070 is $600. Again, $50 over the MSRP. And really the cheapest 9070 XT that's available is $700. And it's sold out anyway, so that doesn't really matter. The cheapest 9070 XT is $720. The one I bought is $730. So AMD didn't deliver on the supply and the price. If they were able to make more of these, then yeah, it'd be pretty crazy. Now, this definitely could be because of tariffs and stuff, especially at the time that these were released. Tariffs were really up in the air and we didn't really know what was going to happen. And now I still don't even know what's going to happen, to be honest, but they've been kind of delayed for a time being. But AMD's cards are still quite expensive. AMD would have had a huge advantage because NVIDIA's cards are so expensive. But if we were to look at PC Part Picker now, for something like a 5070 is going for MSRP right now, which is crazy, $550. If you look at a 5070 Ti, this card isn't as far off of MSRP as it was before. Usually they were going for $900, but most 9070 XTs are not that far off from this 5070 Ti, which is better at ray tracing and has DLSS support. So AMD's cards, they didn't really work out as well as you might think. And that especially brings me to that DLSS stuff. And NVIDIA introduced DLSS 4 upscaling. I don't really care about the multi-frame generation stuff. It's neat, but not really that useful. But the better upscaling with DLSS 4 is pretty amazing. So AMD struck back at the time with FSR 4. And FSR 4 is finally that like shimmer of hope that AMD needs. You know, FSR 4 holds up so well, even against DLSS 4, because AMD finally introduced an AI upscaler. It's pretty damn cool and it looks good, but it does have a couple downsides. And one is that it only works on their 90 series graphics cards. And that's something extremely important to take into note. Some people have been able to mod FSR 4 to run it on RDNA 3 graphics cards. And honestly, it doesn't run that well because you see here on the left side, this is the 7900 XTX, the fastest 7000 series card. And it's getting 60 FPS with FSR 3, and then it's getting 40 with FSR 4. It honestly can't really run on the older gen cards. Maybe they could make a backwards compatible version that wouldn't just be a modded version of the real thing. But at the same time, you know, it's probably not gonna work on their old gen cards because this is an AI upscaler and needs AI performance isn't available on those cards as much. So that's one downside. And that's something that's not that dissimilar to what NVIDIA has done with their technologies. You know, they introduced DLSS 3 frame generation that's only available on 40 series cards, even though nowadays it could probably run on 30 series cards.
Today, we're introducing an enhanced single frame generation model for RTX 40 and 50 series GPUs, which, like the multi-frame generation technique for Blackwell, uses two AI models, one for optical flow and another for frame generation.
So AMD is doing a similar thing. I mean, they're making a technology that is only available on their new cards. That's kind of shitty, but you could argue is a necessary evil because at one point or another, they're going to have to make this leap that their old gen cards couldn't work with it anyways. Then the other downside to FSR4 is something you might not be thinking of at all, because there's a fatal flaw with FSR, AMD's technology in general, and it's because of something of how they built it from the very beginning. You see, NVIDIA has these things in their games that is just a DLL file that has DLSS on it, and you can just upgrade this DLL file if you want to improve the version of DLSS that's on. But AMD chose a different route. AMD made a file that would be in the games that really couldn't be upgraded that easily. It wasn't just a drop-in DLL file from the developers to upgrade the version in the game. So this means that many games don't get that FSR4 upgrade. AMD didn't notice this or think it was important for a long time. Intel introduced their XeSS upscaler, and they just really came around to making graphics cards in like 2022 pretty much. They knew from the beginning that this DLL file was important because Intel's XeSS has always used a one swappable file as well, kind of like NVIDIA does. But AMD didn't fix this whole DLL file problem all the way up until FSR 3.1. which came out in 2024, which means there's still quite a few games, especially if you want to play not the newest shit that's out there, that isn't going to be able to work with the newest versions of FSR. That's why I went through my entire game library. So here is the spreadsheet. I'm going to link this in the description if you want to take a closer look as well. But I want to point out that honestly, I was kind of impressed. So out of the 35 games that I tested here, 17 of them were able to run FSR 4. 23 of them had FSR 3.1, but as you see, there is some games that were lagging behind. 4 of them had FSR 2 still. I didn't even check games with FSR 1. 6 games just had 3.0, and one of those games includes Cyberpunk, which is a pretty mainstream title. One of the things I want to point out, every single game that uses FSR 4 though, doesn't have FSR 4 technology directly integrated into the game. You have to go into the driver to toggle this feature to be on, and that is on the brand new graphics card. So this isn't exactly a very smooth thing for a lot of the cards. In some games like Black Ops 6, I go here and I hit FSR 4. Then what we're gonna do is restart the game. And then it should show up in the menu. This is what I've experienced so far. Yeah, FSR 4 now is within the game. Which is such a weird thing, but you toggle it in the driver, and then now the setting appears in the graphics options, which is a pretty weird thing to see. It also happens in Last of Us Part 2, so kind of interesting thing there. I don't know why it just doesn't detect what card is in your system and allow you to use FSR 4 out of the box. But I can have all kinds of bugs, like a lot of the time AMD's Adrenaline app. Okay, and again, Adrenaline's bugging out. So we have to quit. The overlay doesn't want to show up for me for some reason, so I can't just click the damn button, and I have to close the game, and then I have to right click on my desktop and open it up from there, and it just to flip the toggle to use the upscaler that I paid for on my GPU. And also, I swear to God, in Marvel Rivals, the FSR 4 does not work. First off, it doesn't show in the toggle that it's actually enabled even if you restart the game. And then when you see them side by side running, I don't see a visual difference between the two. And I also don't see a performance difference because FSR 4 typically has a little bit of a performance hit compared to 3.1, but that's just not what we're seeing at all. So in some games you can have these weird issues, you're not sure if it's even working. So you might be wondering is like, well, you know, FSR 4, it's worth it though. Like I want to go through all the rigmarole to make this happen. Well, that's what I was thinking at first because I was like, well, AMD, I mean, they're supporting like half of the games I tested. That's pretty good. What about NVIDIA? What does NVIDIA's DLSS 4 support? Well, you'll be surprised. Even though DLSS 4 just came out in January, AMD's FSR 4 came out at the beginning of March. They both have driver options to put them into games. DLSS 4 is available in 33 out of the 35 games. Yeah, pretty much all of them. If you're on NVIDIA, you're gonna have a good time. Your technology is supported like everywhere, and it's the best looking upscaler. Not to mention too, unlike NVIDIA restricting frame generation to some of their newer cards, NVIDIA's upscaler can be upgraded on anything. You can run DLSS 4 upscaling on a 20 series card from 2018 if you really wanted to. Now it takes a decent performance hit, but you have that available to you. I think is pretty crazy and at least something good that Nvidia has done. You'll notice too that 9 of the games that I tested have DLSS 4 directly integrated into the game. And even have some options, say in a game like Cyberpunk, or in a game like Alan Wake 2, or in a game like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, that you can just go into the graphics options and toggle between the two versions of the upscaling. Whereas with AMD, with every single time you want to use FSR 4, you have to go through the driver. What I also think is crazy in games that just support DLSS 2, as far as DLSS 2, so games like Doom Eternal, Fortnite, Plague Tale Requiem, these games can be upgraded all the way to DLSS 4 through the driver. So this game support list from Nvidia is very, very impressive. All right, that kind of blew me away. I almost got bored when I was testing it because there's nothing interesting going on. The only games that Nvidia didn't have DLSS in, it was Dragon's Dogma 2, which for some reason, there's no FSR in that game either because I can't get either of the upscalers to run in Dragon's Dogma 2. It's just bugged for some reason. I have no clue what's happening on my system. Then also DLSS isn't in Resident Evil 4. But the thing is, Resident Evil 4 was amidst in controversy at the time that it came out because it only had AMD upscalers in it because it was an AMD partnered game. So it got people a little riled up on what was going on there. You're gonna have a way better time if you want to use DLSS in your games. The game support is so much better. What I find crazy is AMD has to manually enable FSR 4 to work in these FSR 3.1 games. They have to approve it for them, and Nvidia does that the same thing with their DLSS upgrade thing through their driver as well. But AMD is so much slower to approve games that they actually work with FSR 4. Oh, you have a situation where FSR 4 should be able to run in the game. Say a game like Hogwarts Legacy. You should be able to run FSR 4 in this game, but it's blocked. You can't use the driver to toggle it, even though it has FSR 3.1 in it. It just doesn't work because they haven't approved it. They recently added quite a bit more titles with the driver update, but this doesn't come nearly as quickly. Maybe it'll eventually be there, but the reliability that a new game that you want to play is going to have FSR 4 support day one on the graphics card that you paid for this feature on, I'm unreliable to say that. I can't confirm that'll be the case. Like a game like Assassin's Creed Shadows, it took AMD a while to add FSR 4 to it. I think it was multiple weeks after the launch of that game. Like, come on. This is the only way to use FSR 4 anyways. Unless you go ahead and mod the games using something like Optiscaler to replace the FSR version in it. With AMD cards, you have to use all these workarounds just to make it work. Whereas with the Nvidia card, like everything's supported out of the box. Now, a little criticism for Nvidia is I wish it was a little bit easier to toggle these upscaler things in the driver menu. I think they could improve that, maybe set a global toggle that in every game that you could use the newest version of the upscaler in every single game. That isn't really available right now as far as I can tell. And also it's like buried deep in the game settings thing. So if this was like a more upfront setting that is more obvious for people to use, that'd be a lot better on Nvidia's side. But at the same time, at least it's available and it works consistently. So FSR 4 is pretty damn amazing, but it leaves me caught in this weird position. I don't know if you can always use it, and in cases that you can't use it, then you're gonna have to mod it in with a tool that you're gonna have to look up a tutorial on YouTube on how to use. So I'm torn with FSR 4. It should be better than it is. So the 9070 class cards were supposed to be just a slam dunk for AMD, and also was the 9060 XT class graphics cards. So Nvidia announced and released the 5060 Ti 8GB at $300, which was absolute shit, universally trashed. Nobody really liked it. The 5060 went for $300 and it was kind of like, okay, I mean, the VRAM is very constricted on it. So those cards are so-so, like people don't really like them that much. So all AMD really needed to do is within this $300 to $380 price point, introduce a card that's decently fast, hopefully as fast as a 5060 Ti, while having more VRAM than the 5060 Ti 8GB, because people are just not going to really want to buy a $400 8GB graphics card from Nvidia if they had a choice. All they needed to do was introduce a 16GB graphics card at $350, which is exactly what they did. The 9060 XT, and quite a few people have been able to buy these at launch. They've been kind of sold out because how popular they are. They're doing very well. But at the same time, they managed to up this launch as well. It should have been the easiest thing they could do possibly. The 9060 XT also has an 8GB model. Yeah, they really just slotted this in right at the end of their presentation. Why does this exist? I don't understand. This one is $300, so the same price as the 5060, has the same amount of VRAM, which is absolutely anemic. It really should have more than that, especially at $300. And as I was editing this, it made me laugh because I found out that the 9060 XT 8GB is not selling that well. You see, it's still sitting on shelves. Surprisingly, right now it's at MSRP, and at least on Newegg, you can get these cards with gift cards at the moment. This Gigabyte one is off by $60, this Asus one is off by $70, this XFX one is off by $30, this other Asus one is off by $110. This makes all the cards drop to $270, which is below the MSRP. I'm wondering if AMD is learning their lesson even so close to the launch. So this 9060 XT 8GB, yeah, it might make them quite a bit of money out of people buying it accidentally when they should be buying the 16GB version of the same card because they gave them the same name to intentionally make them confusing. But it doesn't earn them really any goodwill from anybody. All you're doing is misleading your customers. This is what always makes me think that AMD really isn't that different from NVIDIA. A lot of people are going to cope and say that they are, but AMD did the exact same thing that NVIDIA did. NVIDIA had an 8GB 5060 Ti. They also had a 16GB 5060 Ti. NVIDIA also priced their cards $50 apart. So why didn't AMD at the very least just change the name of the 8GB version of the 9060 XT? Then we could disassociate that card from the good one that you should be buying to let people know which one they should be buying. Instead, they chose the route to mislead consumers and just take advantage of people and their ignorance. AMD's like, what's gonna be different this time, guys? And then they go out here and do the exact same thing, either what NVIDIA is doing or the mistakes that they made in the past. AMD continues to fumble over and over again. And I wonder why they fumble so much, because they virtue signal all the time they're gonna do something great this time around, you know? So AMD obviously makes the chips for the consoles, the PlayStation 5, PlayStation 5 Pro and Xbox Series X and everything. Those are the devices that I think a lot of their development goes into with their chips, that they make this graphics architecture, they combine their CPUs and their GPUs to make the APU that's on these consoles, that the most of that graphics architecture is really built for those, and then we get backported a lot of the stuff on PC pretty much, or sometimes it's a little bit ahead of what the consoles are at. I mean, the cards themselves can be good value, they can have some good technologies in them, but they're not innovating, and they're also consistently messing up pricing. They don't understand the market, who they're targeting. They lie to customers all the time. They cope too about their own marketing, which is crazy. They cope about their own poor products. Like, maybe just don't make a poor product. That'd be too easy. But it makes me think that honestly, if Intel can get it down, honestly think that Intel has a better shot at making GPUs than AMD does, because Intel is already forward looking with their technologies. The first things that they're prioritizing with their architecture was ray tracing and AI upscaling. Those are the first things that Intel was prioritizing, and Intel also made XeSS the right way from the start, where you can upgrade it and integrate it into games. More games have XeSS upgradable into it than there are FSR 4 titles in general right now, which is crazy to say. Now, Intel needs to get quite a bit further with their architecture and everything to make it more practical and also get better performance compared to, you know, GPU die area and everything. But at this point, like, AMD is like, okay, but I don't really trust them to actually make a lead. It just feels like a duopoly. AMD's just maintaining this market because they can, and they're allowing NVIDIA to kind of dominate, and they just kind of take the scraps, and then they get most of their sales from consoles or CPUs and stuff. That's where I'm at with it. Let me know what you think about AMD in the comments below. That's been it for me, though. I'm gonna see you guys in the next video. Can they do anything in the future? Maybe we keep thinking they're not gonna be dumb this time, and then they just keep doing dumb shit. I'll see you in the next video. Y'all have a good one. And if you have an AMD card, enjoy your AMD card. It can definitely be good. Don't get me wrong. Have a good one. And peace.